Hi, my name is Catherine, and welcome to my channel where we talk about books you should read instead of stuff you should buy. In today's video, I want to answer the age-old question, does money buy happiness? Spoiler, it does. And what that entails is rich people gatekeeping happiness from the majority of the population. Of course, money doesn't buy happiness in the literal sense. There are plenty of wealthy people who are deeply unhappy. But it does buy the resources and freedom required for self-actualization. This fact is acknowledged by Morgan Housel in The Psychology of Money. Quote, "The most powerful common denominator of happiness is simple. More than your salary, more than the size of your house, more than the prestige of your job, control over doing what you want, when you want, with the people you want to, is the broadest lifestyle variable that makes people happy. Money's greatest intrinsic value, and this cannot be overstated, is its ability to give you control over your time. To obtain, bit by bit, a level of independence and autonomy that comes from unspent assets that give you greater control over what you can do and when you can do it. A small amount of wealth means the ability to take a few days off work when you're sick without breaking the bank. Gaining that ability is huge if you don't have it. A bit more means waiting for a good job to come around after you get laid off, rather than having to take the first one you find. That can be life-changing. 6 months emergency expenses mean not being terrified of your boss because you know you won't be ruined if you have to take some time off to find a new job. More still means the ability to take a job with lower pay but flexible hours, maybe one with a shorter commute, or being able to deal with a medical emergency without the added burden of worrying about how you'll pay for it. Then there's retiring when you want to instead of when you need to. Using your money to buy time and options is a lifestyle benefit few luxury goods can compete with. I can very much attest to this, as I share in my video on how I retired at 32. The reason so many rich people are unhappy despite being rich is because they aren't spending their money wisely. Rather than slowing down and working less, they continue to sacrifice their time so they can buy more and more stuff and more lavish experiences. Generally speaking, experiences bring us more happiness than material things, but not if you have to work a burdensome number of hours to afford those experiences. Housel goes on to say, the hardest financial skill is getting the goalpost to stop moving, but it's one of the most important. If expectations rise with results, there's no logic in striving for more, because you'll feel the same after putting in extra effort. It gets dangerous when the taste of having more money, more power, more prestige, increases ambition faster than satisfaction. One step forward pushes the goalpost 2 steps ahead. Modern capitalism is a pro at 2 things, generating wealth and generating envy. Perhaps they go hand in hand. Wanting to surpass your peers can be the fuel of hard work, but life isn't any fun without a sense of enough. Happiness, as it's said, is just results minus expectations. I gave this book 4 stars. It was a good read, but it was somewhat lacking. You know how sometimes you read a nonfiction book and you're like, this could have been a blog post? I tend to appreciate short books for this reason, but with a title like The Psychology of Money, I felt like there was so much more to be said. But you're not going to get a scathing critique of capitalism from a centrist lib. Notice how he critiques modern capitalism here as opposed to capitalism. He does at least acknowledge the role that privilege and luck play in building wealth, which I appreciate. Anyway, there's a frequently cited study on income and happiness showing that money buys happiness, but only to a certain point, and then it plateaus. That point was a household income of $75,000 a year, which is around $100,000 today, adjusted for inflation. Obviously, this is an average. It varies significantly depending on where you live and the size of your household. These findings coincide with the theory of the hedonic treadmill, where people return to a relatively stable level of happiness or sadness, despite major positive or negative events or life changes. But this study has since been debunked by more recent studies, showing that happiness continues to increase with income, but there are diminishing returns beyond $500,000 a year. This makes sense when you consider all the ways that money can be used to reduce stress. Financial security eliminates the stress of poverty, but beyond that, with enough money, you can basically outsource every task that you find annoying or cumbersome. And here's the thing, I wish the original study showing that happiness plateaus around $100,000 were true, because that would make my message a whole lot more palatable. Like, then I wouldn't have to appeal to people's moral sensibilities. I could just show that living ethically and sustainably requires no personal sacrifice whatsoever. But unfortunately, this is not the case. Happiness does appear to increase as wealth increases beyond what is ethical or sustainable. So rich people will have to sacrifice some of their happiness, and they're not going to do this willingly. More on that later. My aim with this channel is to show that living an ethical and sustainable lifestyle is not a huge sacrifice. It's more than enough if you shift your mindset. Like, perhaps I could be happier if I had more money, but I don't want to be happier at the expense of other people's happiness. At this point, because I've exercised my empathy muscle, this would just make me sad rather than happy because I'd be riddled with guilt. But a lot of rich people lack empathy, and the data backs this up because they haven't needed to exercise that muscle, so they live in blissful ignorance of the suffering they're inflicting on others with their excessive consumption habits. So what exactly is excessive, you may be wondering? If you ask Peter Singer, a utilitarian philosopher, he will tell you that any unnecessary purchase is unjustifiable because that money could have been donated to charity or directly to someone in need. This is not how I personally choose to live my life, okay? I am not a saint. I think there is a much better metric for judging what level of consumption is justifiable, and that is the one planet metric. We should be free to make unnecessary purchases that enrich our lives, so long as we aren't consuming more than our fair share overall. And our fair share is essentially what the Earth could sustain if everyone consumed as such. In other words, if your consumption level were replicated by everyone on the planet, we would only need one planet. What constitutes a one-planet lifestyle is complex. As of right now, it's not feasible for everyone, particularly car-dependent Americans, because through no fault of our own, we lack green infrastructure. I'll dig into this in a future video. But this general framework is much more reasonable and realistic than expecting people to live by Peter Singer's standards. I'm not asking rich people to make some grand sacrifice and give all their money away and live as a monk with no air conditioning. I'm just asking them to stop gatekeeping happiness from others by consuming more than their fair share. I say this in jest because I understand that asking nicely is not how we solve this problem. If you're thinking, it's not a zero-sum game, my increased happiness doesn't come at the expense of others, you don't understand how capitalism works. I mean, you're right if we're talking about happiness derived from harmless activities or pursuits within the framework of a one-planet lifestyle. But you're wrong if we're talking about happiness derived from a standard of living beyond the one-planet standard. I'll let Jason Hickel explain why we can't all be millionaires.
People have this idea that money is just like almost abstract credits. And so it doesn't really matter if somebody has $1 billion or $1 trillion or whatever, right? But it actually really does matter because the more money you have, the more command you have over labor. This is crucial. Money is command over labor. And so people that have lots of money can command our labor to do the things that they want to do, which is why we have a situation where we are going around building mansions for rich people and curating their lawns and building yachts for them, et cetera, completely mad, right? The purpose of taxing the rich is not so that we can fund public services, right? I mean, this is crucial because the state funds public services directly by issuing currency. The purpose of taxation is to reduce the demands of the rich on our labor and productive capacities so that we can do the things that we as people, as a democratic society, believe should be done. And of course, the other reason is because rich people completely corrupt our society and our democratic processes. It's in fact not even possible for us to have a functioning democracy when billionaires own our press and can rig elections by using campaign finance, just outright buying politicians openly, right? I mean, it's totally mad. And so you want to tax rich people to reduce their ability to corrupt our society so that we can have what we all believe is important, and that is a democracy. So there's very good reasons to tax rich people, but we don't normally talk about what those reasons really are. We're stuck in this fantasy that we have to tax rich people in order to pay for public services, when that's not in fact what the key objective is. The second thing is, this idea that what's great about the American dream is that we can all be millionaires, This is so interesting to me because it's actually if we were all millionaires, none of us would be millionaires. Because what is the quality of being a millionaire? Is your ability to command labor. Right? It's like you talked about the country club and the yachts, et cetera. Someone's got to be building your yacht. Someone's got to be curating your country club.
Mowing the lawn,
bringing you your cocktails, right? If people are millionaires, if everyone's a millionaire, will they be doing that labor? No. Therefore, You will not have the benefits of being a millionaire. The success achieved by some is literally only success because there are other people that are subordinated to work for them doing everything that they want, right? It can only ever be a few, which is why there's no society where everybody becomes elite. It just doesn't happen. It's always a small fraction of society. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is that a society we're willing to live in where most people are subordinated to service the whims of elites? Because that's the reality of having an elite class.
Right.
We're effectively, when you have an elite class, you're devoting your society's labor and energy and materials to servicing their desires, however perverted that might be. This is an irrational thing to be doing.
and it's objectively not good for the majority of people.
Jason Hickel is the GOAT. I cannot recommend his books enough, and I will be discussing them in future videos. As he said, capitalism is an inherently exploitative and undemocratic system. Just look at the state of the world. There's extreme wealth on the one end, mansions and yachts and private jets, and extreme poverty on the other, slums and sweatshops. But even outside these extremes, exploitation is present. There are many regular rich people who don't own a yacht, but are certainly consuming more than their fair share. And many working class people who are not quite poor, but certainly not financially secure. And then there's the middle class, who are simultaneously being exploited by their boss and engaging in the exploitation of others by buying fast fashion and spending their meager vacation time to go on a cruise. Don't even get me started on cruises. Cruises are one example of how oftentimes experiences are just as resource intensive as material things. Anyway, happiness at the expense of others is not an ethical pursuit. There's this short story by Ursula Le Guin called The Ones Who Walked Away from Omelas that illustrates this point well. The city of Omelas is a utopia where everyone lives perfect, blissed-out lives, but their happiness is dependent on the suffering of one unfortunate child. When the citizens of Omelas reach a certain age, they learn the truth about their society, and while they're initially horrified, most accept this reality and choose to forget. But some are so disturbed that they refuse to be complicit and walk away from Omelas. This parallels the capitalist system, only instead of achieving perfect bliss for everyone at the expense of a single unfortunate child, we're accumulating diminishing returns of happiness for a minority at the expense of the global majority. Excess consumption is driving climate change, which is already causing immense suffering and will cause an untold amount of suffering. 60% of the population lives in poverty, and poverty is an incredibly stressful existence. Reducing this suffering should be a much higher priority than increasing the well-being of already well-off people. Yet the latter is what capitalism prioritizes. There's this discussion on social media about people who rich right, typically referring to people who are discreet with their wealth rather than ostentatious. While inconspicuous consumption may be less obnoxious than conspicuous consumption, it's still consumption, and consuming more than your fair share is unethical. To truly rich right is to live a one-planet lifestyle and give the rest of your money away, and I don't really see anyone talking about this. But if you give your money away, are you still rich? I guess it depends on how you define rich. If you're a rich philanthropist, it's very unlikely that you're living a one-planet lifestyle. Take Warren Buffett, for example, one of the world's top philanthropists. Buffett lives in a modest 6,500 square foot home in Omaha, Nebraska, worth $1.5 million. Yeah, I would not call that modest. Even Billie Eilish, who is a lot closer to riching right than most rich people, is still not exactly living a modest one-planet lifestyle. I don't want to single out Billie Eilish here. She seems like a genuine, compassionate person and deserves props for calling out billionaires to their faces. But generally speaking, rich people love to pat themselves on the back for their philanthropy, but then they do be buying mansions with pools. What's happening here is called moral licensing, and we all do it to some degree. We think the good we do cancels out the bad we do, and we use social comparison to justify our bad behavior. Your ecological impact may be lower than most people in your social circle, which makes you feel justified in your purchases. But if your social circle is a bunch of rich people, you're likely consuming well beyond your fair share. Some of the biggest climate criminals, like Jeff Bezos, have this mentality. They think that funding environmental initiatives absolves them of their environmental crimes, and it absolutely does not. As far as gatekeeping happiness goes, the wealthiest among us deserve the most blame, but we shouldn't let ourselves off the hook for our own excessive consumption because we're not as bad as Bezos or Zuckerberg or Elon. I recognize that the harm caused by our consumer choices can be pretty indirect. It's not as if not booking that cruise vacation is going to directly increase the well-being of some impoverished person somewhere. This is a systemic issue that requires policy change. On the whole, the rich are not going to voluntarily lower their standard of living, so trying to appeal to their moral sensibilities is somewhat futile. They need to be taxed, as Jason Hickel said, to reduce their demand on our productive capacity. That being said, our individual consumer choices do matter. As individuals, we can't opt out of capitalism entirely, but we can metaphorically walk away from Omelas by minimizing our participation. Thank you so much for watching. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe so you can stay tuned for future videos. Alright, peace out.